On 19th of September 1968, in the central lowlands west of Tam Kỳ, the monsoon sky hung so low it seemed to press against the earth itself. Sheets of warm rain blurred the tree line into a green smudge, and every low depression in the red clay track had become a shallow pool of murky water. Inside the cramped hull of M48A3 Bravo 24, loader specialist Daniel Keating wiped sweat from his brow, even though the interior felt like a sealed steel furnace. In that sweltering moment, half blinded by humidity, deafened by engine vibration, he sensed something the others didn't. The quiet, wrong kind of silence that always came before the jungle erupted. Keating had never looked like the kind of man who would change the direction of a fight. 22, wiry Catholic kid from Milwaukee, always laughing too loud, always tinkering with things crewmen had no business touching. But that morning, as Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry pushed along Route Lime toward a suspected Viet Cong staging ground, the rain intensifying and visibility collapsing to barely 40 meters, he was the only one wrestling with an idea that everyone else dismissed as foolish. In his ammo pouch, wrapped in cloth to keep from rattling, he carried a dented, palm-sized mirror from an old ration kit. To the crew it was a joke. To Keating it was a possibility, one he had no intention of using unless their lives depended on it. The convoy's mission sat at an uncomfortable crossroad in the broader Vietnam War. In late 1968, with US forces shifting into even more mobile operations and escalation still uncertain, the Viet Cong in this sector had grown bolder, using hidden spider holes and reverse-slope bunker complexes to ambush cavalry units on the move. Their fire discipline and camouflage outmatched even aerial reconnaissance on days like this. The enemy had mastered how to vanish into terrain and hit from angles that no tank sight could reach. That was the pressure bearing down on Captain Holbrook's column. Advance, expose, survive, adapt all at once. The jungle made sure every man felt watched. Bamboo thickets bowed under rainwater, and the sucking mud slowed the armored column, forcing intervals to widen as engines strained. The familiar Vietnam cocktail, decaying vegetation, diesel exhaust, cordite residue from last night's contact, hung in the air. Radio nets crackled with intermittent static, the storm playing havoc with communication. Even the wipers on the M48A3 barely kept up, smearing more than clearing. Somewhere ahead, beyond a knotted patch of elephant grass, an invisible enemy waited. Then the first indicator arrived, not with gunfire, but with a vibration through the ground, subtle yet unmistakable. Keating felt it through his boots. Then came the sound, a deep, compact thump, and a geyser of mud erupted 12 meters in front of their lead tank. RPGs rarely announced themselves so politely, but a command-detonated mine certainly did. The Viet Cong had chosen their moment with surgical intent. The next explosion hit closer, showering Bravo 24 with mud and shards of root. Through the rain-streaked vision blocks, the gunner cursed. He couldn't see anything. The TC yelled for suppressive fire, but suppressing what? There was no target. Only angles, only shapes, only the ghost of movement in a landscape built to conceal. The VC had positioned themselves on a reverse grade, far below the crest, firing upward at the American armor. They were invisible to the gunner's primary sight. The coax couldn't depress far enough. Neither could the 90mm main gun. Bravo 24 was effectively blind. Another explosion. Then small arms fire, harsh and disciplined, cracked from concealed fighting pits. The infantry riding behind the tanks scrambled for cover, sliding in mud, shouting over the storm. 2 men went down before anyone even identified where the shots were coming from. Inside the tank, panic pressed tight against the noise. The TC barked, "Find them! Keating, eyes out!" But Keating already knew. No conventional method would give them what they needed. The VC had built perfect dead ground positions. You couldn't engage what you couldn't see unless you saw it differently. Keating reached into his pouch. The mirror was still wrapped. He hesitated, not out of fear for his safety, but for fear of looking foolish. He had mentioned the trick 2 weeks earlier, using reflective angles outside the tank to spot reverse slope muzzle flashes. The others laughed. Tanks didn't use mirrors. Mirrors got you killed. But now, facing an enemy they couldn't visually acquire, the absurd suddenly felt like the only rational option. He shouted to the TC over the engine's roar. "I'm going outside." The TC spun toward him in disbelief. "The hell you are! RPG's out there!" But Keating didn't wait. He threw open the loader's hatch as rain hammered the armor like thrown gravel. The world outside was a chaos of mud spray, angry muzzle cracks, and the metallic clang of unseen rounds pinging against the hull. He climbed halfway out, flattened himself against the turret, and extended the mirror beyond the armor's edge, just far enough to catch an angle below the tank's normal line of sight. At first, it showed nothing. Only rain, grass, soil. Then, there, a flash. Faint, yellow-white, quick as lightning, but unmistakable. A VC firing aperture half buried in red clay. Keating snapped back inside and yelled bearings to the gunner. The gunner slewed the turret. Fired. The 90mm thundered, sending a shock through Keating's ribs. The round impacted the slope, throwing earth into the air, collapsing part of the hidden pit. Another flash appeared in Keating's mirror. Another bearing, another shot. Soon the tank was engaging an enemy no one else could see, guided entirely by a stupid mirror trick, improvised in the heart of a monsoon ambush. But the enemy adapted quickly. They shifted positions, firing from alternating pits to confuse targeting. The rain worsened, making reflections harder to catch. Bravo Company began taking heavier fire as the VC realized the Americans were striking dangerously close to their previously untouchable locations. Keating wiped the mirror with the sleeve of his soaked jacket, blinking past the sting of water in his eyes. He knew he had seconds, maybe less, before they lost the advantage he had bought them. He leaned again into the storm, extending the mirror farther this time, desperate for one more flash. The next muzzle burst was closer, much closer, and when he saw it, he knew the next decision would determine whether Bravo 2-4 survived the fight or was swallowed whole by a reverse-slope kill zone designed with their destruction in mind. Keating ducked back into the turret as a burst of automatic fire stitched across the armor just inches from where his head had been. The tank lurched as the driver threw it into a slight pivot, mud churning under the treads. Water poured through the open loader's hatch and splashed across the floor plates, mixing with oil and spent casing residue. The TC leaned down, grabbing Keating's shoulder, shouting to be heard over the storm and gunfire. "You keep doing that. You're going to get your brain punched out of your skull." But Keating wasn't listening. He had already leaned out again, the mirror trembling in his hand as he tried to catch another reflection. The enemy fire was coming from no more than 30 meters now, angled upward through cleverly disguised trenches that disappeared under vegetation. The Viet Cong weren't suppressing, they were adjusting, probing, testing how long it would take to break the Americans' nerve. On a day like this, with visibility crushed and radio clarity collapsing, the hidden enemy had every advantage the terrain could offer. The next muzzle flash in the mirror was brief but bright. Not a pit, something bigger. A reinforced firing shelf built under a packed-over shelf of clay and roots. Keating shouted direction and depression. The gunner cursed. It was outside his normal firing range. He had to manually override the stabilizer. The TC authorized it with a slap to the turret roof. The gunner input the angles by hand. The 90mm recoiled hard, shaking the rainwater off the turret in a shimmering spray. Keating peeked again. The slope erupted, roots and red clay collapsing into the hidden aperture. Screams rose faintly over the rain, then fell silent. The infantry behind the tanks, pinned earlier, began advancing cautiously, emboldened by the armor now punching holes into the invisible kill zone. But the enemy still had cards to play. A mortar thumped somewhere beyond the ridgeline, slow, deliberate, almost lazy beneath the chaos. Keating knew that sound, an M49 or Chinese Type 63, light enough to move and hide between shots. Seconds later, a round exploded to their rear, showering infantry and stinging shards of bamboo and dirt. Another landed closer. The VC weren't just holding ground, they were shaping the battlefield, tightening a noose around the armored spearhead. Inside the tank, the gunner muttered, "They're walking it toward us." The TC barked into the radio for counter-battery support, but the interference from the storm turned his transmission into static. Every second without artillery support tilted the fight further against them. Mortar crews in Vietnam rarely fired more than 3 rounds from one location before relocating, their efficiency drilled to perfection. Unless the tanks could pinpoint those tubes before they moved, Bravo Company would be chewed apart. Keating wiped the mirror clean again, his hands shaking from adrenaline and the cold sting of rain. The VC pits had been clever, but this mortar team was deadly. If they guided indirect fire into the stalled armored column, even the thick M48 armor wouldn't save them from plunging fragmentation. He leaned out once more, angling the mirror lower, attempting to find an indirect fire signature on the slope. Nothing. He adjusted again. Still nothing. Mortarmen were ghosts by nature. Then he caught something. Movement, not light. A faint shift in grass far down slope, like figures ducking in and out of cover. The mortar tube itself was invisible, but the loader recognized the pattern of men relaying ammunition. "Bearing 084, he yelled. "Down angle! They're further than the pits!" The gunner tried to traverse, but the depression was impossible. The main gun could not angle low enough to direct fire on the mortar team. The coax wasn't effective at that distance or angle. The TC cursed under his breath. "We can't hit them from here." Keating's mind raced. The mirror was never meant to guide artillery, but if they could get coordinates... His eyes flicked to the infantry platoon, advancing through the mud behind them. Sergeant Mendez, the platoon leader, was already aware of the mortar threat. His men were pinned down, huddled behind a fractured tree trunk that offered no real cover from indirect fire. Keating shouted across the rain, pointing down the slope. Mendez followed the gesture, then keyed his handset. The infantry FO tried again to raise fire support, but the storm drowned his call. The sky itself seemed determined to isolate them. Another mortar round arced overhead, landing dangerously close to Bravo 24. The blast rocked the tank and knocked Keating against the hatch ring. His ears rang. Something warm trickled down his cheek. Blood or rain, he couldn't tell. The TC grabbed him. "You're done. Stay inside." But Keating ripped free, driven by something beyond survival, obsession maybe, or stubborn conviction that the mirror could still make a difference. If they couldn't use artillery, then maybe... "Driver, move us forward," the TC ordered, hoping to crest the rise just enough to expose the mortar team. But as soon as the tank nudged upward, RPG fire erupted from the left flank. 2 rockets screamed across the field, one passing over the turret, the other detonating in the mud beside the driver's track assembly. The tank halted immediately. They were boxed in. A lesser unit might have broken. Bravo Company didn't. But Keating knew they were nearing the point where courage stopped mattering. Without the ability to engage the mortar crew, the Viet Cong would whittle them down methodically, and the rain was only getting worse. He angled the mirror once more, higher this time, not to see the enemy, but to catch the reflection of Bravo 24's own turret optics. A crazy idea, a stupid one. He lined up the mirror so the gunner could see his own coax sightline bounced back at him, allowing him to adjust elevation using an improvised feedback system. The gunner realized what Keating was doing. "No way that works." "Try it!" Keating yelled. The turret adjusted. Slowly, awkwardly, but it adjusted. Another mortar thumped. The loader held his breath. The coax opened fire, stitching the far slope with tracers, not at a bunker, not at a pit, but at the invisible arc where Keating had triangulated the movement. The tracers vanished into mud and foliage. Then one hit something solid. A man shouted. A short, startled cry carried faintly through the storm. The next coax burst struck deeper. Another figure fell. The mortar fire stopped mid-sequence. Keating collapsed back into the turret, soaked, shaking, but alive. The mirror lay in his lap, cracked down the middle from shrapnel he hadn't noticed. But the fight was far from over. The VC had lost their mortar, but they hadn't lost the will to kill the tank that found them. And now, with their positions compromised, the enemy prepared for a counterattack brutal enough to erase the embarrassment of being outmatched by a mirror. The rain eased for only a moment, thinning from a furious sheet into a trembling veil, and in that brief clarity the Viet Cong revealed their next move. Dark figures slipped from trench to trench, carrying RPG tubes, satchel charges, and captured American grenades. They weren't retreating, they were repositioning, tightening their web around the stalled armored column. Men who had built the kill zone now prepared to close it. Inside Bravo 2-4, the internal lights flickered as the electrical system strained under water intrusion. The driver tried to coax the engine to full throttle, but the mud beneath the treads sucked at the steel with hungry resistance. They had forward movement, but only inches. The TC's voice cut through the cramped turret. We stay put. We die. We move forward without clearing that flank. We die faster. Keating felt the words settle like weight on his sternum. The cracked mirror lay near his knee, glistening with rainwater and blood. He wondered if it had fulfilled its purpose, spotting pits and a mortar team invisible to optics, and whether any further attempt to use it was worth the risk of exposing himself again. But hesitation was a luxury Vietnam never allowed. The gunner scanned through the fogged primary sight, cursing the condensation that no amount of cloth ever fully cleared. Movement left, 3, maybe 5, can't tell distance. His voice broke with frustration. The rain returned in a sudden, punishing sheet that turned the world into a green and grey blur. The enemy knew it too. Weather was their camouflage, their ally. Then an RPG streaked through the curtain of rain, its smoke trail nearly invisible, until the split-second flash of activation. The rocket slammed into a tree trunk just short of Bravo 2-4, detonating with a sharp concussive blast that rocked the turret. Splinters of wood and metal fragments rattled across the armor like hail. The driver yelled in pain as a shard tore into his shoulder. The TC grabbed the intercom. Bravo 2-6, Bravo 1-2, this is 2-4. We're taking heavy RPGs from the left. Push fire on that ridge. Static answered. The storm had swallowed their network again. On the ridgeline, VC shapes flashed in and out of view as they shifted firing angles, using the terrain like a second skin. They were disciplined, no wild bursts, no wasted movement. Every RPG launch was timed between rain gusts to reduce visible signature. They were playing chess in a downpour, and the Americans were the pieces being knocked over. Another rocket screamed overhead, this one passing so close above Keating's open hatch that the pressure wave punched the air from his lungs. The tank rocked. The TC slammed the hatch down, sealing them in steel and darkness. Keating forced his breathing steady. The mirror was broken, but he wasn't done with it. Carefully he peeled the two halves apart and inspected their edges. Jagged, sharp, reflective enough. A stupid idea in two pieces was still an idea. He rewired his thinking. He didn't need one mirror to see the enemy. He needed angles. He wiped the glass with his sleeve and held one shard at arm's length, testing the reflection against the turret periscope. The gunner glanced at him, incredulous. "You're not serious." Keating wasn't sure he was either, but then the tank shuddered violently as a satchel-charge detonated somewhere to their right. Infantry shouted in terror. Something metallic groaned. Another vehicle taking damage. The fight was collapsing around them. He climbed halfway up the hatch ladder, just enough to re-establish visual contact with the outside world through the periscope slits. The rain burned against his face like hot needles. He angled one shard downward. Nothing. Then he angled the second piece to overlap the first. The reflections aligned. He saw them. Not clearly, never clearly in Vietnam's jungle, but he saw movement across 3 separate fighting holes, staggered in depth along the left rise. He saw the outline of an RPG gunner kneeling behind a woven mat of grass. He saw the faint flash of a spotter raising his arm to signal timing for the next shot. "Left ridge, 80 meters, 3 positions," Keating shouted. "Turret left. Elevate." The TC didn't question him. "Gun up." The 90mm swung. The gunner fired. The round hit the first fighting hole like a meteor, blasting earth and shredded vegetation skyward in a muddy plume. The RPG gunner vanished beneath the collapse. Keating checked the mirrors again. 2 more positions adjusting, shifting, compensating for the loss of their forward shooter. He relayed the next bearing. Fire. The second position folded under the concussion, the blast wave rolling across the slope and bending small trees like reeds. The rain hissed as it hit the superheated crater. The third VC gunner fired just as the tank's turret realigned. The rocket erupted from its tube, streaking toward Bravo 2-4 in a deadly arc. Keating glimpsed it in the reflection, shouted instinctively and threw himself back inside. The RPG hit the glacis plate with a thunderclap. The explosion hammered the tank, shaking every bolt, every weld seam. Shrapnel ricocheted inside the turret ring, and the driver screamed again as more fragments tore into his shoulder and ribs. Panels fell from their mounts. The intercom cut out entirely. For several long seconds, the crew could hear only their own ragged breathing and the rain pounding relentlessly on the scorched armor. "Driver's hit bad," the gunner said, voice trembling. "We can't move much." The TC keyed the dead intercom instinctively before remembering it was gone. He slammed his fist against the radio housing. "We're blind and stuck. We need to finish that ridge before they swarm us." Keating looked at the broken mirror pieces in his hands. They were slick with rain and a thin smear of blood. His or someone else's, he didn't know. His nerves were shot, his muscles trembling, but he forced himself up again. He wasn't just spotting now. He was hunting. He held one shard low and one high, manipulating angles with frantic precision as bullets ricocheted around the turret exterior. The reflections revealed the faintest hints of another cluster of VC fighters preparing to rush the tank with satchel charges. Keating shouted directions. The coax answered with blistering fire, tracers cutting through the rain like threads of burning copper. Several figures collapsed mid-sprint. Others dove back into the trenches. The push stalled. Infantry from Saratude Mendez's platoon seized the moment, rising from muddy cover to press forward under the umbrella of tank fire. Their silhouettes moved like phantoms through the smoke and rain, advancing yard by yard toward the dug-in VC positions that had nearly ended Bravo Company's spearhead. But the storm, the terrain, and the killing zone still belonged to the Viet Cong, or at least they believed it did. Keating knew the mirror trick couldn't last forever. But he also knew something else. The enemy was starting to fear the tank they could no longer hide from, and fear made even disciplined fighters predictable. The air around Bravo 2-4 tasted of metal and mud, the bitter signature of a battlefield tilting dangerously toward its breaking point. Smoke from the earlier RPG hit still lingered near the glacis, mixing with steam rising from the rain-striking scorched armor. Keating felt every vibration of the M48A3's engine struggling beneath him, the once confident hum reduced to a sick, uneven growl. The driver lay slumped beside his controls, drifting in and out of consciousness as the gunner desperately tried to keep the turret functional. Outside, the Viet Cong reorganized with unsettling speed. Despite their losses on the left ridge, they were far from defeated. They were seasoned fighters who understood how to exploit chaos, especially American chaos. Rain slicked the jungle floor, masking footfalls. Trench lines snaked behind the slope, linking pits into a labyrinth designed to confuse and reappear elsewhere. The enemy had no intention of withdrawing. They were preparing for a coordinated surge, a final effort to overwhelm the stalled armor with proximity explosives. Infantry from Sergeant Mendez's platoon advanced under heavy fire, pushing through knee-deep muck, firing from the hip as they bounded between shattered tree trunks. Their shouts blended with the crack of AK-47 fire and the dull, rhythmic thumps of grenades, tossed in arcs that vanished into the rain. The Americans fought with desperate resolve, each step forward a contest between adrenaline and exhaustion. Inside the tank, Keating clutched the two mirror shards as if they were instruments of fate. His hands were numb, trembling, but he forced them steady. Through the reflections, he searched for movement, anything that signaled the next threat. The rain blurred everything, turning muzzle flashes into smudges of orange and silhouettes into ghost-like shapes. Then he saw it, not a muzzle flash, not a runner, a shadow, larger, crouched, hefting something heavy. A satchel-charge team preparing to rush the tank from a trench line that extended dangerously close to Bravo 24's right flank. They had used the earlier chaos to dig deeper, inching toward the vehicle like termites carving into wood. If even one man reached the track assembly, the explosion would cripple the tank beyond recovery. Keating shouted the bearing. The gunner pivoted the coax, but the depression angle could not drop low enough. The trench was too deep, too close, too well hidden. He had to go out again. The TC saw the intention flash across Keating's expression and slammed his hand onto the loader's chest. "Don't you dare!" "They're coming with satchels," Keating said. "If I don't spot them, this tank is gone. You go up there now. You won't make it back down." Keating met the TC's eyes. Rain drummed on the turret roof like fists demanding entry. The loader said nothing more. He didn't have to. In war, some decisions weren't debated. They were absorbed, quietly, heavily, and with the full weight of their consequences. The TC closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing hard, then lifted his hand. 5 seconds. Not one more. Keating climbed. Rain slapped his face instantly, cold and heavy. The battlefield stretched before him as a shifting grey mass of smoke and spectral movement. He raised the mirror shards high, angling them quickly, searching, adjusting, desperate. There. He caught a flash of wet cloth, the curve of a bamboo pole rigged to extend a satchel-charge's reach. 2 VC fighters were creeping up the trench wall, preparing to leap out and sprint toward the tank. Keating yelled the angle down into the turret. The coax fired, the tracers hissing through the downpour, but they hit the lip of the trench instead of the men inside it. The VC saw him. A burst of AK-47 fire tore across the turret, sparks spitting off the armor. Keating ducked, sliding halfway back inside, heart hammering wildly. The TC grabbed his collar and yanked him down fully, slamming the hatch shut as another burst rattled the steel dome above them. "Did you get the angle?" the gunner asked. Keating nodded breathlessly. "Lower! Much lower! 10 more mils!" The gunner adjusted manually. The coax fired again. This time the rounds traced directly into the trench. A muffled scream rose and then abruptly cut off. A second burst followed, collapsing part of the trench wall. The looming threat of a satchel-charge rush had been halted for now, but the battle was shifting again. A sudden, unnatural lull fell across the ridgeline. Gunfire slowed, movement quieted. Even the rain seemed to soften, though only barely. The gunner whispered, "That's not good." The TC exhaled. "They're repositioning." Keating knew the pattern. Viet Cong assaults often came in waves, probing attacks, suppression, flank pressure, then a decisive push. And that push usually followed a coordinated lull meant to confuse Americans' sense of timing. They were resetting the board for their final move. A low whistle pierced the air. Signal, not wind. Then the jungle erupted. VC fighters surged from concealed positions along the ridge and trench networks, dozens of them, moving with terrifying unity. RPG gunners took knee positions, their tubes angled downward. Riflemen provided covering fire. And trailing behind them, the worst sight imaginable, satchel-charge runners stripped down to minimize noise and drag, each one gripping explosives capable of tearing the M48 open like a tin can. The coax opened fire, shredding the first line of attackers. Infantry from Mendez's platoon fired and fell back, trading space for survival. Smoke grenades popped, obscuring parts of the field, but the heavy rain quickly thinned them out. The Americans were being pushed hard, harder than any moment before, and now the question wasn't whether Bravo 2-4 could see the enemy, but whether it could hold long enough for reinforcements or artillery to break through the storm's interference. The TC slammed the radio set again, as if sheer frustration could force a connection. Nothing, just static. Keating raised the mirror shards once more, angling them toward the left, then the right, mapping the flow of the assault. He relayed every shift in movement, guiding the gunner like a second set of eyes, detached from the turret's limited field of view. The coax overheated. The gunner switched to burst discipline, firing in controlled snaps. Smoke poured from the barrel shroud. But still the VC came. A runner broke free from the melee, sprinting toward the tank with a satchel charge locked to his chest. Keating screamed the bearing. The gunner fired. Mud exploded around the runner, but he kept coming. Another burst struck him in the legs, sending him tumbling, the explosives detonating prematurely in a cloud of fire and soil. More figures surged behind him. Bravo 2-4 was reaching the limit of what a tank could do in isolation, and everyone inside knew it. Then, faint and broken, a sound filtered through the static of the radio, a call sign, a response. Someone had pierced the storm, and reinforcements were coming. The voice crackled through the radio like a ghost, pushing through layers of distortion. But it was unmistakably real. The TC grabbed the handset, nearly shouting into the receiver, "This is Bravo 2-4. We are pinned, driver down, ammo low, multiple VC elements closing. We need immediate support." Static swallowed part of his plea, but the reply still came through, warped by the storm. "Falcon, inbound, stand by." Air support. Even the promise of it shifted the fight. But Keating knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the final wave reached them. Reinforcements meant nothing if Bravo 2-4 fell before the aircraft could break through the low cloud ceiling. He raised the mirror shards again, scanning, praying they would show him something they hadn't before. Every inch of the battlefield crawled with danger, muzzle flashes licking through the rain, figures dashing between trenches, runners preparing for one last suicidal charge. The gunner breathed heavily, sweat dripping down his jaw despite the cold interior. "We're almost dry on coax. Switch to Willie Pete if they get close," the TC said, wiping rainwater from his eyes. "It won't be pretty, but it'll push them back." The driver groaned, his breathing ragged. Keating kneeled beside him for a moment, wiping the blood away from a deep cut on his shoulder. "Hold on," he whispered. "Help's coming." But outside, the jungle exploded again. A coordinated yell rose from the ridgeline, a harsh, raw sound that cut through the storm like a blade. The Viet Cong surged forward in their largest wave yet. Dozens of fighters, moving as one organism with a single purpose: swallow the American armor before aircraft could arrive. RPG teams advanced under covering fire. Satchel-charge runners looped wide to flank. Riflemen peppered the tank with sustained fire that pinged off the hull like a swarm of metallic insects. Keating angled the mirrors, one downward, one outward, catching 3 different reflections at once. He shouted bearings faster than the gunner could adjust. "Left, right, down 10, up 5, there, there, there." The coax roared. Tracers carved lines through the rain, cutting down the first wave. A runner collapsed mid-stride. Another fell into a crater. The turrets swung, firing again and again, but each adjustment cost them time, and time was what the enemy sought to exhaust. Then, with terrifying clarity, Keating saw a silhouette stand atop the ridge, RPG tube raised, braced, aimed directly at Bravo 2-4. Keating screamed the direction. The gunner fired half a second too late. The rocket launched. Time slowed. Keating saw the smoke trail curve downward in the mirror's reflection, angling for the turret ring, the tank's most vulnerable angle. The TC shoved Keating down instinctively. The rocket slammed into the turret seam and detonated. Light filled the tank. A violent, concussive pressure wave tore through the interior, ringing Keating's skull with a high-pitched howl. Everything went white, then black, then flickered back in watery fragments. He tasted blood. The TC lay sprawled across the turret basket, dazed but conscious. The gunner clutched his headset, screaming without realizing it, ears bleeding from the shockwave. The tank didn't die, but it was close. Sparks rained from a ruptured panel. The coax jammed. The turret hydraulics whined unpredictably. The radio sputtered into silence again. Rain poured through a new crack in the cupola seam, dripping like tears onto the turret floor. Outside, the VC cheered. Keating forced himself upright, fighting dizziness. He grabbed the mirror shards again, though they slipped in his trembling hands. One was bent. The other had lost part of its reflective surface. But fragments were enough. They had to be enough. He lifted them toward the periscope, overlapping angles, searching for the RPG gunner who had fired. He found only smoke. He scanned left, movement. Right, more runners. Behind them, another team raising a satchel-charge on a pole. "Guns down," the gunner groaned. "Hydraulics shot. I can traverse, but not fast." Keating felt the walls of the tank closing in, pressure from outside and inside merging until he could barely breathe. But one thought cut through the panic. The mirror trick had never been about seeing perfectly. It had been about seeing anything at all. He steadied his hands and aligned the two shards once more. Rain hammered the outside of the tank, the sound merging with distant thunder and the nearer crack of small arms fire. Reflections blurred, then sharpened as he adjusted angles with manic precision. "There!" he shouted. "Bearing 032, runner with satchel." The gunner forced the coax mechanism into partial alignment. He fired in short bursts, the weapon grinding and jerking with each shot. The rounds struck the runner's path, churning mud. The man stumbled, regained his footing, and sprinted harder. Keating leaned up, exposing himself through the hatch, using the mirrors like extended vision to guide the gunner. Bullets snapped around him. One ricocheted off the hatch ring and sliced a line across his cheek. He ignored it. "Up 2, left 6, fire!" The burst hit home. The runner collapsed, the charge detonating harmlessly in the mud. But more were coming. Suddenly, a new sound rolled over the battlefield. Not thunder, not mortars. Rotor blades, low, heavy, beating the air with unmistakable force. 2 UH-1 gunships pierced through the rain clouds, their silhouettes emerging like green phantoms with miniguns slung beneath their noses. Falcon flight. The VC wave faltered instantly. The lead Huey dove, unleashing a torrent of 7.62mm rounds that stitched across the trench network. Dirt and bodies erupted. The second gunship swept wide, firing rockets that impacted the far slope in a chain of concussions that split the ridge open. The jungle, moments before alive with enemy movement, now erupted in chaos and confusion as the Viet Cong scattered, their perfectly orchestrated attack collapsing under the punishing weight of aerial firepower. Keating fell back into the tank, his muscles giving out all at once. The mirror shards clattered to the floor beside him, cracked, bent, useless now, but they had done their job, better than anyone had believed they could. The TC pulled himself upright, blood trickling from his ear. "Loader! You crazy son of a... How the hell did you see all that?" Keating managed a weak, exhausted laugh. Just needed the right angle. Falcon flight circled overhead, firing in controlled bursts until the last of the VC assault broke and retreated into the jungle. Rain swallowed their silhouettes as they fled. The battlefield quieted at last. Mud steamed. Trees smoldered. The air trembled with the aftershock of violence and the low thrum of circling UH-1 engines. Bravo Company had survived. In the days that followed, Specialist Daniel Keating was medevaced to Chu Lai for evaluation. His injuries were minor, but the psychological weight of the fight clung to him like damp air. The driver survived after surgery. The gunner suffered partial hearing loss. The TC wrote a report so detailed and furious that word of the mirror trick spread through the cavalry battalion within a week. Some dismissed it. Others admired it. But no one ignored it. Keating returned to his unit a month later. His mirror trick was never officially added to training manuals. It was too unconventional, too dependent on circumstance. But crews whispered about it nonetheless. In a war defined by invisible enemies and impossible terrain, any tool that tilted the balance, even slightly, became part of the oral doctrine of survival. He rotated home in 1969, lived quietly, never spoke much about the fight at Tam Kỳ, but he kept one thing from that day, one of the mirror shards, still cracked, still stained faintly with rusted blood, not as a trophy, as a reminder that sometimes improvisation was the only difference between life and death. The legacy of that battle lingered among the men who lived it. They remembered the rain, the mud, the suffocating fear. They remembered an enemy who fought with terrifying discipline. And they remembered a loader who refused to let blindness decide their fate. Vietnam was full of stories like that, small moments where individual will reshape a battle's outcome. Moments rarely captured in official histories, yet carved deeply into the memories of those who endured them. War was not won by perfect strategies. It was survived through imperfect men making impossible choices. And sometimes it was survived through a mirror held at exactly the right angle. Dump, if you want more true-to-the-bone Vietnam War stories like this, let me know. And if you felt this one, don't forget to stay for the next documentary.